Hi everyone, welcome to our first discussion on Luke 22, 7 through 38. We've called this Poured Out, and it's this discussion of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. And the title comes from Isaiah 53, when it says about the servant of the Lord, that God will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors.
Yeah, you can really get a sense of the picture of what's unfolding of Jesus with his disciples and holding up this cup with a pitcher and pouring wine into it, that color of red. And he says to them, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. He's really trying to help the disciples really to understand what is about to happen, what he's about to do for them.
So the disciples would have understood that from the Old Testament perspective, blood is everything. The blood is the life. That's in Leviticus 17:14. For the life of every creature is its blood right. is life.
Yep.
And so this pouring out of Isaiah 53:12 fits really well with that cup at the Last Supper. And it calls to mind this covenant that God made with Israel in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus.
Right. Yeah, Moses is called by the Lord to go up in Exodus 24 to go up onto Mount Sinai, bring the elders with him, and in the midst of that, a statement's made that this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all of these words. And so you hear the language that Jesus uses, this is the cup of the new covenant of in my blood, is virtually the same words that are said to the elders, Moses in that context. And then Moses it goes up with God, and the elders are supposed to stay back. They aren't supposed to go with him, continue on, but they actually go too. And you expect the elders actually to be put to death because they weren't allowed to be in the presence of God. But that's not what happens. Actually, what happens, Exodus 24:11, it says that they sat down and they ate a meal together with God. It's a covenant meal. In fact, whenever covenants were established in the Old Testament, meals always accompanied it. There was a covenant meal that basically manifested this sense of oneness and communion and life, the meal, feeding you and bringing you together and giving you life, and that's what the covenant represented, and that's why they had a meal at the end of covenants.
And that old covenant is also brought to mind through the references to the Passover. There's 6 references in these 14 verses to the Passover.
Yeah.
And it's especially emphatic at the beginning of this section where it says that the Passover lamb must be sacrificed.
Yes.
Now, if you don't remember, the Passover lamb was something way back in Exodus, where the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed and its blood was put on the doorposts of all the Israelites' houses. And that was a deliverance that God provided on his way to liberating his people from Egypt.
Right, you can't miss this Exodus motif that Luke ties in. Actually, if you go all the way back to Luke chapter 9, where the transfiguration happens, Moses and Elijah show up on this mountain with Jesus, and Jesus is glorified and shines and is radiant. And as they talk with one another, it says that they talked about Jesus' departure. When you look at that in the Greek, the word actually is exodon, it's based on the word exodus. And so they were talking about Jesus' exodus, this deliverance that Jesus would bring about, just like Moses did out of Egypt, bringing the people out. But this time, rather than deliverance from a people, it was a deliverance from really our greatest enemy, that of sin.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think in this passage, Jesus is really prepping his disciples for his departure.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of Old Testament background, but what's really going on, Molly, between Jesus and the disciples.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, it's if you're familiar with John's gospel and how he portrays this moment in Jesus's life. He has what's called the upper room discourse, where he's really preparing the disciples for what is to come. Luke is a lot more succinct with it, right? He is talking to them about how he's going to suffer. He is urging them to remember what he has done for them.
Yes.
He's also giving them instructions for how they should be in his absence. They have this little disagreement about who's the greatest.
Yeah.
And he emphasizes that the one who wants to be greatest is the one who needs to serve. So he preps them just for how they're supposed to be amongst each other. It says the greatest amongst you is like the youngest, and the one who rules like one who serves, because I am among you, he says, as one who serves. So you just really get a sense of Jesus's pastoral heart for his disciples, his real relationships with them, where he's preparing them and trying to get them ready for what is about to happen.
Yeah, and a good pastor is full of encouragement for the people he's shepherding and caring. And you see these just wonderful words of encouragement throughout this passage that Jesus speaks to the disciples. One of my favorites is just at the very beginning. He simply says, I have longed to eat this meal with you. I'm very eager to eat this meal with you. This sense of he just wants to be with his disciples in this last moment, how much he loves them. It's almost like a ministry of presence, just being there with them. He knows how important that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's such an example for us in our lives with each other, of being by each other's sides through these challenging moments. Because what could be more challenging than this moment?
Right,
That's what Jesus does.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of how we remember this when we eat communion, and how we expect Jesus to be there with us as we, through the Spirit, as we take communion together. And he eagerly desires to meet us there as we join together in communion.
Another line I love that Jesus says is later on to them. He says, I know you were the ones who were with me through my trials. Mm-hmm. And that just touches my heart, that Jesus knows that it's hard to follow him. Mm-hmm. It's hard to stick by his side, because difficult things happen when you proclaim the name of Jesus and stand up for him. And he looks at his disciples and says, I know that you were there with me. Mm-hmm. And boy, I hope that the Lord can say the same thing about me one day. I'm standing before him face to face, that he looks at me and says, well done. I've watched you, and I knew you stood up for me. That's what a great word of encouragement.
Absolutely. Yeah. But if we don't feel like Jesus would be able to say that to us, he also has a word of encouragement to Peter, who we know is going to go on to deny him.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that in a future session in more detail. But I have just always loved that Jesus tells Peter that he is going to deny him.
Yeah.
And yet that's not the end of what Jesus says to him. He says, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Yeah. That Jesus is confident that even though Peter will fail, just as so many we fail in so many different ways, there's still something for him to do to serve Christ, right? That he will be able to rise above it and care for his brothers just as Jesus had.
Yeah, didn't you just, weren't you saying to me that he actually changes his name?
Yeah.
Like, rather than calling him Peter here, he calls him Simon, sort of going back to that earlier name. It's almost like a statement of intimacy and love as he encourages them. I mean, he's just brimming with words of encouragement and love for his disciples. And this is at the most excruciating moment in his life. And I mean, he says to them that I won't eat of this meal again until basically the kingdom comes, or I'm in the kingdom, and which is an encouraging statement, because it's coming, right? And we are going to eat of this meal again. Or at the end, he says, I confer a kingdom on you, as my Father has conferred a kingdom on me. And it's like, oh my goodness, what have I done as a disciple to bear the weight of the kingdom of God. But Jesus thinks, well, it's yours now. Run with it. And so, again, in the midst of the darkest 24 hours of this man's life, here he is just speaking words of great strength and encouragement to his disciples.
Mm-hmm. Maybe with the exception of Judas.
Well, that's true. he didn't say words, and that kind of goes back to the counsel that you were talking about. He's a realist too. He didn't pretend that all was okay, that hard stuff is hard stuff, that suffering was happening, that he was going to bleed, that he was going to die, that they were going to be shaken in their faith, and none of that surprise. He's a realist as well.
I think that's a lesson for us too, that Jesus calls a spade, right? And I think sometimes we as Christians, we think we need to kind of pretend everything's okay, especially maybe on a Sunday morning. We want to come in and pretend that all the struggles that we felt during the week are nothing because we have this faith and we're supposed to be bright and cheery all the time. But when we're not honest about that suffering that we're going through, it prevents that ministry of presence from reaching us, both from God and from each other.
Yeah. But again, in the midst of that, here Jesus is speaking hope and assurance that in the midst of the real hard things, he continued to be an optimist because he knew who held his life in his hands, God the Father. And he also knew that he holds the keys of life and death, and that all of this too shall pass.
So I hope there's a lot for you all to talk about in your group on Sunday, and we hope that you have a really wonderful, rich discussion with this passage and all that it has to teach us about Jesus and his coming and his crucifixion and resurrection.